So tonight we're going to be speaking about Benjamin Franklin Butler, who was a major general of the U.S. Army, had a very colorful career in Virginia and New Orleans, and then back to Virginia, and had some interesting political views as well. We're going to welcome in a second Dr. Elizabeth Leonard, who is from Colby College up in Maine, where hopefully it's cooler than it is here in Virginia and a little bit less humidity. And we're going to start going. We've got some folks from Texas and locally. So please feel free to come on in and we'll get started here and welcome Dr. Leonard. Let's talk a little bit about Dr. Elizabeth Leonard. She's been teaching at Colby College in Maine since receiving her PhD, and she's been a professor from 1992 until recently when she retired. One of the key points in her career, which is very impressive, of course, is that she won the Lincoln Prize in 2011 for her book called Lincoln's Forgotten Ally, and Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt of Kentucky. And she has recently completed this biography on Benjamin Butler, who, again, not a lot of recent scholarship about him, kind of a lot of rumor and kind of regurgitated information about him, and a lot of books about him being the Beast, which was his nickname, and we're going to find out from Professor Leonard why that may not be the best characterization of Benjamin Butler. But again, welcome, Elizabeth, and we're glad you're with us. Good evening.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay?
I hear you great. I hear you great.
Thank you. Here, and thank you for inviting me. Thanks
for being with us. And before we get into kind of the chronology of Benjamin Butler, having read the book and specifically your introduction, which is fascinating about the extensive archival material about Butler that really wasn't used very often or very frequently or extensively before you start on this biography. Can you tell us a little bit what's out there at Colby and other places?
Yes, there is a massive archive at the Library of Congress. There, which is just enormous, hundreds of boxes of material there. There's material in Louisiana. There's material in Massachusetts at the Public Library and the Massachusetts Historical Society. There's material at Colby, of course, and that's some of the material that is least used. There's stuff at Smith College related to his daughter Blanche. I mean, there's just, I have referred to Butler in other settings as like Forrest Gump. He's Forrest Butler. He's everywhere in his lifetime that was important, and the spread of his archives reflects how he was far and wide, and his archives are too.
So what was his relationship with Colby College?
He was a student at what was then known as Waterville College from 1834 to 1838 when he graduated. He was not particularly happy to be at Waterville College. He had wanted very much to go to West Point, but his mother hoped dearly that he would become a clergyman, and she wanted him to go to Colby, or Waterville College as it was known, and that's where he ended up.
So in the archival material at Colby and the National Archives, is that primarily military or personal or correspondence, diaries?
Everything.
What's out there?
Everything. So the military material, a lot of that was published in the personal and official correspondence that his granddaughter published in the 5-volume set. The originals are all at the Library of Congress. But then the material also goes all the way back to his early life and all the way up to his death, and it's personal stuff and it's official stuff as well. So it's quite a mix, and it's mostly well organized, but I was distressed that some things are out of order, and it takes a little while to get to know your subject well enough to know that things are out of order. But, you know, over years of doing it, you start to realize, hey, that's not when that happened. That belongs in a different folder. And I'm not holding the library archivist responsible for that. It's just, you know, this is a massive collection.
So when did you start this project, and how long did it take you to kind of come to be able to write the book?
I have been acquainted with Mr. Butler for as long as, you know, I've been studying the Civil War. One just does encounter him frequently in that area of study. But I was not particularly interested. I always had other projects going. I wasn't particularly interested in working on him, even though I knew about the Colby connection. In 2013, however, the college took out of storage an enormous portrait of Butler that he had delivered to the campus himself a couple years before he died. They took it out and hung it up and asked me to write a legend for the portrait. And that's when I really started thinking, well, he is kind of interesting, and we do have this stuff. But I was still involved in other projects then. But I guess that's when it really started. And then, as I've said in other settings, I was at a conference with Gary Gallagher, and I made a snarky remark about being jealous that Bowdoin has Joshua Chamberlain and all we have at Colby is Benjamin Butler. And he gently scolded me and said, maybe you need to investigate him a little bit better if that's how you feel. And he was right. So to some extent, we all owe Gary a debt for me pressing on.
So as a reader of Civil War history for 30 years and recently a professional historian, partially of the Civil War, it seems like every account of the War of the East and biographies of Grant, and Butler comes across as uncouth and unprofessional and a problem child for other generals. Where did that reputation come from? Is that fair? Is it generated from Grant biographers who want to make Butler the foil? Where does that reputation begin?
Well, let me say that if you go back to the beginning of the war, certainly the first year, when he's getting troops to Washington and into Maryland, and then when he's at Fort Monroe and so on, actually the reputation is pretty good. Harper's Weekly had him on the cover and said, you know, this is the guy who's going to save the nation and win the war and so on. The sort of negative impression or the negativity that you see around him comes later. And I think it's true. I would never deny what much more expert military historians would say were his stumbles as a, you know, commander of troops in the field, for example, or even planning a campaign. But he wasn't so much worse than a lot of other officers in the Union Army. And so I am led to believe that a lot of what has lingered as negative views of him, which Grant contributed to and Butler himself contributed to with his particular personality and so on, is also, but a lot of it lingers because it's filtered through the way historians have talked about him. And I think historians for a long time were beholden to a certain, or were associated with a certain kind of narrative about the war that made Butler look bad. And I will also add that I think Butler really ticked off a lot of people who might have liked him otherwise, even after the war. So as the post-war period developed and Butler took a particular stance, people that might have, put their arm around him and said, "You're our guy," tended not to say that anymore.
So tell us a little bit about his career up until 1860. What was his politics, his job? He was a lawyer, or tell us what you can about that.
Yeah, he was a lawyer in Lowell, Massachusetts. He started out in New Hampshire. He was born in New Hampshire, but moved to Lowell, Massachusetts after his mother went there to become a boarding house keeper with the Lowell Mill girls. And that's where he spent much of his youth and most of his adult life. He became a lawyer after he finished college at Colby or Waterville College. And his early years as a lawyer were spent largely defending mill workers and so on. And then he was involved in real estate and he owned shares in mills and that kind of thing. He was a Democrat. He saw himself as a Jacksonian Democrat, and he was pretty loyal to the party until the war. And of course, one of the most famous, best known things about him is that he was, at the Charleston Convention in 1860, he voted for Jefferson Davis more than 50 times. And that's been held against him. One of the many things that's been held against him for, ever since, throughout his life and since he died and up to the present.
Well, was he involved in the abolition movement before the Civil War?
No, I would say his interest in slavery and dealing with slavery was really a product of his wartime service. Mm-hmm. His focus, he later in his life said, "I've always been with the underdog." And I think that's true, but his sense of who the underdog was early on did not include the enslaved people. His focus was on the working people, laborers in Massachusetts and elsewhere, white laborers, I should say. Yeah.
So did he have any political offices or political interests before the war?
Well, he was, like so many lawyers in his day, also involved heavily in politics. So he was making his way in the Democratic Party, both in Massachusetts and nationally, which is why he ended up at the convention in Charleston. Obviously, not just anybody went, So he was interested. I don't think he had, he did have some interest in political office, but that wasn't as clear as certainly after the war.
So how did he transfer from this civilian life to becoming an officer for the Union Army?
He had been, I mentioned that he had wanted to go to West Point. He was always disappointed that he couldn't go. And one of the ways he made up for his disappointment at not having been able to go to West Point, besides grumbling about West Pointers for most of the rest of his life, is that he joined the Massachusetts Volunteer Militia. So he was involved in the military at the local level. And when the war came close on the very near horizon, he was quick to mobilize those forces and to work with the governor of Massachusetts to make sure that he and the Massachusetts forces would have a role to play. And that sort of led him into very early weeks of the war being quite involved and then ending up at Fort Monroe and so on.
Okay, so let's talk about his early career with the Union Army. He, as you say, he was with the Massachusetts troops. And where was his first kind of year or so? I know, having read your book, that he eventually went to New Orleans and had something of a controversial experience there. But before that, what was his military career before going down to New Orleans?
Well, the first major event in his military career is getting those troops into Washington to defend against an anticipated incursion by the Confederates. So he was in Annapolis. Then he got troops there and sent them to Washington and opened up a pathway after the crisis in Baltimore for Union troops to get into Washington. He then took charge of Baltimore, somewhat, I won't say against the wishes of Winfield Scott, but certainly a little bit going off on his own to do something that he thought was important for holding Maryland in the Union. And then he ended up at Fort Monroe in Virginia, where he created the contraband policy that I think deserves much more credit than it often gets for having launched or pushed the federal government and even the president in the direction of emancipation. He basically had to decide what to do with 3 enslaved men who came to Fort Monroe and said, don't send us back. He had to decide what to do with them, and the federal government had not yet determined what to do about this policy, about escaping slaves. And he forced the decision, I'd say.
So tell us more about that. This is something where it was a military officer getting seriously involved in a political question. And so how did that work? Right. Was he involved with Lincoln much, or the cabinet? What happened there down in that incident?
Well, he seems to have requested answers to questions. What should I do? What should I do? And those questions were not answered. And he had to make a decision in a rather short space of time. Either you send him back or you don't send him back. And pretty soon a representative from the slaveholder was back at the fort saying, give me my slaves back. So he had to make a decision, and he worked his way through to the decision whereby he said, well, if the slave owners will say we are going to take the oath of allegiance to the United States, then we will send them back, because then the slave owners will be falling under the rubric of the Fugitive Slave Act. But if they won't say that and they cling to their identity as secessionist Virginians, then they don't fall under the Fugitive Slave Act, and therefore I do not have to send them back. I mean, it was a bit of trickery that his brilliant legal mind could come up with. He didn't have the authority per se to make that policy, but nobody stopped him. And in fact, the general feeling was just let it happen and we'll sort of see how it works out. And sure enough, within a few weeks, really a couple of months, Congress is passing the first Confiscation Act, and things are starting to move. And of course, as soon as those first 3 enslaved people are protected, there's a flood, a massive flood of enslaved.
So this is a little early for Lincoln to make these calls, right? He was kind of, and if I remember right, John Fremont out west was also kind of doing the same thing in Missouri or Arkansas, right?
Lincoln would say, no, don't do that, and David Hunter, not much longer also. Right. But this, each situation was different. Lincoln was moving as, methodically as he could, and sort of by not even really responding to Butler's query, what should I do? He kind of let it happen without having created a policy himself. And the policy was only for Fort Monroe. It wasn't this, it was those, right? It wasn't like this entire department is now and forever free. It's like, well, we'll just call them contraband of war. And he also kept records of their names and their value and so on. So in theory, it still fit under the notion that, they can be returned if the war comes to an end, right? So I think Butler was himself still working through his ideas about, this is the beginning of him really coming to grips with slavery.
Well, it's interesting that 46 years before that, Governor Dunmore of Virginia was also trying to entice runaways to come and serve his force too. So it's interesting in the same area, in the same geographic area.
Right. And well, and it's exactly where the first enslaved people arrived, which
Yeah.
is also interesting.
It
And
is.
now the home of Hampton University, which is basically the descendant of the schools that Butler and his team built in Fort Monroe, you know.
Wow. Yeah. So we talked a tiny bit about Butler getting down to New Orleans. How did he move? How did he get from Fort Monroe to this position of authority with the capture of New Orleans in 1862?
Yeah, he was sort of dismissed from Fort Monroe, eventually replaced there after, I mean, he did have a tendency to ruffle feathers, to stir the pot. There's so many ways you could describe it. And I think there was some, you know, so he was replaced at Fort Monroe. He was then sent off to do some recruiting in Massachusetts. And then it wasn't really clear what he was going to do. He very much wanted to have a command of significance. And in early 1862, that command was offered to him in terms of sending him to New Orleans, which he was quite happy about being able to do.
And how did things go for him in New Orleans?
Well, I think that he did the very best job he could do under the circumstances he faced. I was rereading today some stuff around New Orleans and remembering that the town itself was in utter chaos. I mean, really almost anarchy when he arrived, and a very complicated population there of foreign consuls and Creoles and native people and slaves. I mean, it was just a very complicated situation. And it's also, you know, a very long distance from the center of power in Washington. It's the first major city that the Union had been able to invade and conquer. And so or try to conquer and hold. It's the place where Reconstruction actually, you know, has its first test. Can you bring this entity back into the Union? Can you suppress this relentless rebellious spirit, not least among the women of the town? So his job was very hard. And meanwhile, of course, you know, enslaved people are once again running to his protection. It was a very complicated situation. And I think he did a very good job. And I was just reading something today that was talking about how in the 19th century, many of the way when people talk about Butler as a beast, because this is where he, of course, got that nickname, and talk about his tyrannical and harsh and brutal occupation of New Orleans, they forget that in the 1860s, American military men didn't have a lot of experience of conquest and occupation the way they would after, say, World War II, right? So it was a very different situation for him. And he made a lot of people really mad. On the other people, there were a lot of people that loved him, even New Orleanians, who, once he was replaced by Nathaniel Banks, were begging him to come back and clean it up again and get rid of the yellow fever and so on.
So the tale that you hear in almost every story about his declaration about women, the Southern women, and somehow they would tell us about that. I mean, I don't want to give away the game here because it's your story, but what was the controversy about declaring Southern women something else than upstanding citizens?
Right. Yet another, you know, contributing factor to his reputation as a beast. But he was very quickly became quite fed up with the rebelliousness of white Southern women, white Confederate women, so mostly elites, for their rude treatment of his soldiers. And he basically said early on, I'm not going to put up with this. In the same way I should have mentioned William Mumford, that he wasn't going to put up with some guy pulling the flag down from, the mint. And he's not going to put up with these women misbehaving. He didn't execute any women. He did execute William Mumford. But he said, if this is how you're going to behave, we're just going to treat you basically like prostitutes. He didn't use that language, but that's what he said. We're going to throw you in jail. We're not going to make a distinction. And this caused a huge uproar among white Confederate men, among European consuls who were in town, who thought this was just an outrageous way to treat women. As it happens, it basically quieted the problem right down. And a couple women were thrown in jail for good measure, but then they were released, and he didn't execute anybody, and things did settle down. But the outrage to white Southern womanhood was a source of great, anger towards him, which is always interesting because, of course, the same white men who were outraged by his treatment of white women were meanwhile, of course, abusing their women slaves, relentlessly.
What happened after New Orleans? What was his role in the war for the next year or so after that?
Well, the next place he really makes a significant contribution is in Virginia, when he becomes the general of the Army of the James, and has so many Black troops under him, and that makes that's an important development in his understanding also of the situation of Blacks in America, and contributes greatly to his shifting views on civil rights and slavery and so on. So he was in New Orleans all the way through 1862, and then he gets into Virginia in 1864. He has a period of kind of a sort of a hiatus where he's talking about the war and trying to figure out where he's, what he's going to be when he gets to grow up as a general, and hoping for a command, and then he gets one.
So what did his views on abolition and slavery evolve during the war, or was he always an advocate of abolition and Black rights?
No, I would say his views of Black rights were developed directly in relationship to his direct experience of slavery, and then his experience of Black soldiers and their courage and their willingness to sacrifice everything for their freedom, and their excellence as soldiers. And so you can really see this was somebody who didn't think much about it, about slavery, becomes somebody who thinks very deeply about it, and then particularly becomes very fond of his soldiers in the Army of the James, and really never looks back after that in terms of his views on civil rights.
Now, up to this point, when in Army of the James, he became the commander in 1864, did he have a relationship with Lincoln, or what was Lincoln's position on Butler? How would you describe that?
I think that Lincoln realized that, I think their relationship was complicated. I think that Lincoln realized that he had in Butler an important link to Democrats, war Democrats, as long as Butler was associated with the Democratic Party. I think he clearly recognized that Butler had tremendous administrative skill. He was a very good administrator. He was a little bit, had a tendency to fly off the handle or go off on his own when he felt like his military superiors were not, allowing him to do what he thought he should do. This was a problem. He had a huge ego as well. And he was never hesitant to get into a squabble. He was not. So I think there was a personality, there was tension there. And also, I'm sure Lincoln, believed that Butler got a little too big for his britches. But we know that Lincoln was very good with, he had a lot of people like that around him. So he certainly tried to handle Butler as best he could. I think he felt that Butler was very useful in very many ways, and he couldn't spare him. I think that's fair to say, but he also couldn't just let him run free. So he was always trying to figure out how to deploy Butler's great strengths and control his tendencies to go off on his own.
So by the beginning of 1864, U.S. Grant becomes the 3-star general, commanding general of the U.S. Army. And as you mention and well know, very partial to West Pointers. And Butler was not a West Pointer, but all the other Sherman, Sheridan, Thomas, Schofield, all these generals that were West Pointers, that was Grant's real purpose. And in the beginning of 1864, you had this 4-pronged attack of the Confederates in Virginia, and you had Grant and Meade being West Pointers, and Sigel in the Shenandoah Valley, and Butler on the James River, not West Pointers. So, what was Grant's relationship with Butler? What was his kind of way of operating with him?
My sense of that is that Grant, similar to Lincoln, recognized that Butler had significant skills that could be deployed. When I looked through, but I got the sense that Grant got tired of having to maneuver around Butler's, the conflicts that Butler had with his subordinate officers, Gilmore and Smith. I think that Butler so earnestly wanted to have military glory and also be, I think, considered if not on a par with Grant, to be in with Grant. And I got the sense that also grew kind of tiresome for the more reserved and sort of just go do your job. Here's your job, go do your job, Grant. That's the sense that I got from reading about that campaign. But I like Lincoln, I think Grant knew that Butler had these strengths that were really valuable in terms of his administrative skill, his ties to the Democratic Party and to war Democrats generally, and so on. And although it was Grant who initially used that language about bottled up Butler in reference to Bermuda 100 and sort of set in motion that epithet, that then chases Butler for the rest of his life and beyond. It's important to remember that he also, in his personal memoirs, seemed to walk that back a little bit and say, I think that I was too harsh with some people. He wasn't even just saying that about Butler. And then he said Butler was really a valuable contributor to Union victory, and he should be remembered. He was never somebody who wasn't faithful to the United States.
So in 1864, Grant put himself with Meade's Army of the Potomac, kind of an overland campaign against Lee's army. You had Sigel in the Valley. And as you just said, Butler was down in the James River, Bermuda 100. What was Butler supposed to do to contribute to Grant's strategy in Virginia in the spring of 1864?
My understanding is that he was supposed to, what was the phrase that Grant used? Skin one of the legs. You can two can be skinning a leg, or whatever that phrase was. But he was supposed to anchor one end of this 3-pronged assault on or attempt to get to Richmond. And he understood himself to be expected to create or to establish a stronghold of Union soldiers as close to Richmond as possible, Richmond being his objective. He said later that he felt that that Grant had sent him confusing orders, and that he, maybe he was supposed to go to Petersburg, but that it wasn't entirely clear. But he ended up with his soldiers at Bermuda 100 and couldn't get past there. And that's where the notion that he got sort of stuck and floundered and failed.
So
that came from. Although Grant then did manage to extract a lot of soldiers from there and continue his campaign, and eventually, obviously, win the war.
So at some point, Butler became involved in coastal operations in the Carolinas. What was that about? When did that happen?
Are you talking about Hatteras?
Yes.
Inlet? Yeah, that's back earlier in the war, right? Isn't that 1862? And he was able quite effectively to capture a bunch of equipment and soldiers as well, if I'm not mistaken. I don't remember the details of that campaign as well.
But he did have success, and so...
He did have success, as he did at Fort Monroe, as he did in New Orleans, as he did in Baltimore and Annapolis.
But at some point, Grant decided he had had enough of Butler.
Yeah.
And was that after the election of 1864, or when did that happen, where he decided he would replace Butler?
After Fort Fisher, when there were these two, Butler made an attempt to capture Fort Fisher. He had also been involved in this digging of a Dutch gap on the James River, which didn't go so well and took much longer than expected. And then they blew up the mines and nothing happened. At that time, nothing happened.
Right.
It didn't open up the river, and it seemed to be another failure. Fort Fisher, he makes an assault or plans one that seems kind of crazy, but everybody agreed to it, that you're going to blow up this gunpowder filled ship and it's going to open the way to capture the fort. And then they don't capture the fort. And a second assault is required to do that. But it's after that Grant just kind of says, no, this is really, it's time to stop now. And he, basically fires him.
So it's ironic that Grant was critical of Butler for the Dutch Gap Canal, whereas Grant tried several canals on the Mississippi at Vicksburg, which were also equally unsuccessful.
Yes, and that is a quality of the memory around Butler that I find interesting, that things get stuck to him that don't stick to others. Even if you think about Big Bethel, that he gets attacked even in modern times for the stumble at Big Bethel early on in the war, as if it was a bigger failure than Bull Run, for example, that sticks to him. But he also had green troops. He also was finding his, so that's interesting to me, that seems to be a repeating pattern for Butler.
So when Butler was relieved, do you think that that the war had gotten to the point where Lincoln and or Grant didn't need any Democratic generals anymore?
It's an interesting question. I would hesitate to say yes to that, only because they would still have been thinking about Reconstruction and reaching out to Democrats in Reconstruction. But I think Butler himself seemed maybe less necessary. And perhaps there was some idea that there would be a different role for him. And of course, so much we don't know I think Butler and his allies hoped very much that, for example, he would get an appointment in the cabinet in Lincoln's second term. And perhaps he might have, maybe they were moving in that direction. Something I was reading today was saying maybe the best thing that ever could have happened to Butler would have been for him to become Secretary of War. Maybe that's where he really needed to be, but because of the assassination, we just don't know what might have happened there.
So after he's relieved, what was the rest of Butler's career and activities during the Civil War?
Well, he didn't, he mostly went around giving speeches after he was relieved for the rest of the time, and sort of figuring out again, what's going to happen to me now? What am I going to do next? And angling maybe. I think he also hoped by then his politics were closely aligned with the radical Republicans. He wasn't technically a Republican at the end of the war, but I think he sort of thought maybe he could become a representative of that view in Lincoln's cabinet. He was sort of trying to figure out what he was going to do. And he was giving speeches and sort of trying to correct some of the ways, or I should put that in quotes, but to revise public opinion of how he was seen based on what Grant, the fact that he had essentially been fired as he understood it. And that was humiliating for him. So for a while, he's trying to figure out what he's going to do next. And then he ends up in Congress.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the interesting things that you mentioned in the book is that he wrote a very lengthy account of his experiences in the war. And how accurate is it? Or I guess
you mean his autobiography?
Right.
You mean the autobiography, right?
Yeah. And how obviously you have to take it with a grain of salt, but how did you approach using that source when you wrote this book?
Yeah, the autobiography is a fantastic source, and one that must be approached with great care and not suspicion, but clearly the recognition that the goal of writing the autobiography for him was to a great extent to correct the errors that he thought the historical record had made about his military service. And I personally find it sad, because I'm so interested in his whole life, that so much of the autobiography is about those 4 years of the war. I mean, really, you would think you wouldn't be able to guess from just looking at the chapter headings that he had such a illustrious career after the war, because so much of the book is about the war. But that was the central experience of his life, clearly.
Sure.
And I think that it has a lot of reports in it that are just official reports. I mean, he just duplicates a lot of that stuff. So that's just official reporting. But he's clearly, unhappy with the way history has treated him and the way he felt that he had been maligned. Fortunately for, someone like me, he's so obvious when he's ticked off. It's not like you can be misled into thinking, oh, it's neutral. It's so obvious when he's really trying to fight back against, some reputational blemish that, you don't have to be, it's easy to see when he's fighting back and sort of then go to look to other sources and see what they say. But also I think it's important, and it was for me, to try to understand why, like him, without the same personal feeling that he had, but why is it that the record has stayed like this? Why did he feel this need to fight back? Who was it who was attacking him? What was the dynamic that was in play there?
So tell us a summary of his illustrious career after the war.
Well, he spent 10 years in Congress, 4 terms, 4 two-year terms consecutively, and then he was out, and then he was back for another 2 years. And during those years, of course, from 1866 to basically 1876 or 78, he was involved in all of the most important developments, money policy, women's suffrage, Reconstruction, civil rights, the rise of the KKK. I mean, he was involved in all of that stuff. And I think really took a very strong line that was consistent with what the radical Republicans had initially identified as the agenda they sought to pursue. Of course, the radical Republicans fade away, the moderates come in, the Democrats come in, and Butler's sort of trying to hold this line and becomes very much one of a minority in that perspective. You know.
So during those years, did he remain a Democrat or was he a Republican at that point?
He was a Republican, but
okay.
And of course, this has been described by many historians as being, you know, a sign of his fickleness, you know, but I see it, and he would have said, and I think it's true, it's not that he was fickle, it's that the party's policies changed and he stayed in one place. He was not loyal to party above his policies, above his views. So when the parties, you know, he went to the party that he thought was closest to his point of view. So he was a Republican, but then he went back to being a Democrat, and then he was supported by the Greenback Party and Labor parties and other, you know, the anti-monopoly party. I mean, he just ends up, his point of view struggles to find a home, I guess is the best way to look at it. And he does also become governor of Massachusetts. I don't want to forget to say that, for one term, 1 year.
We do have one question here, Elizabeth, and that is, somebody's asking, why do you think no one has written a modern biography about a major general in the Union Army, especially in 1864 during the culminating campaign of the war? Why didn't anybody write this before?
Well, he is not an easy person to write a biography for. There are many challenges in terms of just getting to the source material, and you cannot possibly read everything there is. You can't. I read a lot. I worked on it for many years, but there's a lot out there. There's a lot of controversy. Wading through the controversy is challenging, and I think he's just a difficult figure. There were biographies written of him in the early 1960s, but in the centennial of the Civil War. But those were largely really quite critical. And since then, this is really the first modern one. But I think he's a challenging figure. And a lot of people in Civil War history, in the years that I've been involved in writing it, I have discovered that historians tend to write a lot about the same kind of stuff over and over and over again. Plow that field again. Let's plow it one more time. And then there are whole areas that are just left completely untouched. And my early work was on women in the Civil War. That's a good example. James Martin, some of his early work was on children in the Civil War. When I saw his books on the experience of children in the Civil War, I remember thinking, how is it possible we've gotten to almost the year 2000 or whenever they were, and nobody's written about children in the Civil War? I mean, and then Drew Faust writing about the meaning of death. What was that massive death like? Another subject that's like, we always can have another biography of Lincoln, but then there are these areas that just get left aside, And I do think, I was thinking today, somebody said to me, why is it that, are there other figures that are like Benjamin Butler whose stories need to be told? And the first person that came to my mind was Adelbert Ames. I thought, why is his son-in-law why doesn't he have a modern biography? And I went looking, there's nothing on Adelbert Ames. And he was so important in this effort to enforce radical Reconstruction and so on. And apparently a better field general than Butler.
Another question is about Butler being interested in abolition and contrabands, was he looked on favorably by the radical Republicans, or did they kind of look at him with suspicion because he was a Democrat?
I think they looked on him quite favorably, actually, and their sense is that they were very pleased. He was very good friends with Salmon Chase, sorry, and I mean, I think that he became very close to the radical Republicans, you know, as long as they were active, and then they faded away, and he was sort of on his own. With regard to the contraband, I think that some people have suggested to me that, you know, really his contraband policy was very demeaning, and he really only wanted those men for labor. And even the term contraband is a pejorative term because it likens those human beings to property, to physical, you know, to things.
Sure.
And I understand that perspective, and I won't deny it, but I also think it's easy to project from what we know today and where we are today onto that time. And I'm not saying he wasn't bigoted, because he was a man of his time, who grew up when he grew up, and, you know, he had to evolve. There's no question about it. But I think he did a lot to free those enslaved people, and he used trickery to do it, basically. I mean, he was just very wily, and he used his wiliness to do it, and I think that's a good thing.
Another question from the audience: did Butler remain active in veterans affairs after the war?
He loved to go to veterans events, and particularly he loved, if he could get there, to go to events that involved soldiers from the Army of the James. There's a lovely story towards the end of the book of him participating in a grand review in Washington that was, you know, in the late, you know, in the last years of his life. And he loved to do that kind of thing. I don't think he was particularly involved in sort of regular meetings, but veterans wrote to him abundantly, not least of all Black veterans. And he gave a lot of help to Black veterans who were seeking pensions, and he never charged them a penny for his help. The help that he offered as a lawyer to help them get pensions, he felt very particular about that. And actually, somebody once offered him money, and his response was to say, I never do that, and I'm not going to do it now, and I've never done it before. And he was quite crabby about it, actually. So he felt very devoted to his Army of the James veterans.
What do you believe is his biggest contribution to the country?
Well, wow. I think that his biggest, that's a difficult question to answer. I would say that in some ways the contraband policy is so important because it sets a certain process in motion. But I think his time in Congress after the war fighting for Black rights is enormously important. He stood for the Civil Rights Act. He stood for desegregating West Point. He stood for the anti-KKK acts. As governor of Massachusetts, he nominated the first Black judge in the United States. And so in his lifetime, his contributions as a politician were huge in terms of advancing social justice, or trying to advance what, you know, we would call social justice today. Another way to answer your question, and this is why it's a difficult question to answer, is for me today, thinking about why Butler is important to us today, how can he contribute to us today? I think his story says a lot about the possibility of transformation in a person. And stick-to-itiveness without fear. You know, I've been accused of wanting to lead a noisy, fearless life. And I'll tell you, if that goes on my tombstone, I won't be sorry, you know? And so he's a courageous figure in the past who reminds us, it's easy sometimes to think, well, people in the past, you know, we're stuck with the way things are now because, you know, of the past, and people in the past didn't know any better. Some people knew better and they tried to do better, and they offer us good models for our own development and relentless determination to make things right. So in that sense, his story today may be his greatest contribution. And I know this is an answer taking a long time to answer, but this book was held up by COVID for a variety, just a lot of complexities around that disease and archives shutting down, et cetera. And the George Floyd event fell in the middle of one version of the book and the revision of the book. And I actually think that's a good thing, because those events of that year, that summer, and the great struggle for racial justice that we are still living through here helped me to see Butler's life in a different way.
This has been a great talk, and I hope people really study Benjamin Franklin Butler. The book's great. I read it. I'm not just saying that. It was very enjoyable. I'm totally interested in seeing biographies about folks that haven't been covered before, and you have done that. Let me once again thank Elizabeth for being with us tonight, sharing the story of Benjamin Butler. Great story, and we're glad you were with us.
Thank you so much for having me. And I always apologize that, you know, I'm not a military history expert, so I apologize for any stumbles I may have made there.
Not to worry.
It's a long life, and it was a very full life, and it's a lot to remember. So
yeah, noisy and full.
Noisy and full, exactly. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, thank you very much, and glad you were with us. Best wishes to you, and for all our folks that joined us tonight, we thank you, and we'll see you at our next program. Have a good evening.